There are some corners of the universe which have bred the most terrible things, things which go against every essence of our being, things that inspire a nameless terror in all unfortunate enough to happen upon such things. Such terror which turns blood to ice, which turns the refuge of sleep to a domain of nightmares, which stalks one like a shadow every waking moment. Such terror defies the bounds of scientific examination, can never truly be known. No amount of light can ever dispel it. So very paralyzing is this terror, it never dares ask what lays beyond these horrors. Like ancient castaways transfixed by a shark, never do they contemplate what greater terrors hide in the depths, which inspires the same fear in the shark as the shark does in them. They may never know what drives this predator to such desperation, never knowing that the hunter has become the hunted. Their only thought to survive this battle of monsters. When the Borg first attacked Earth in 2366, no one, not even Captain Picard, who had been captured and assimilated into the collective, truly knew the Borg's motive. Those survivors of Wolf 359 find a single question on their mind that lingers in the back of one's mind as they go about their lives, only to come to the fore in the cold, dark hours of the night, where the refuge of sleep becomes elusive, and the question, why? Why did the Borg suddenly become interested in humanity? Why did they travel so far to assimilate just one species? And why was the assimilation of Picard, one man, so important to them? Why did they need Locutus? These questions were doomed to go unanswered. Closure would remain out of reach for Starfleet. Would the Borg attack again? How soon? And how many? In the absence of certainty, Starfleet resolved to prepare for another attack, adapting existing designs and creating new classes that would be better able to confront the Borg. Unfortunately, this process was continually frustrated by a single key factor: knowledge, or lack thereof. Apart from sensor logs recovered from the battle and the findings of a handful of ships, little was truly known about the Borg. The only thing Starfleet knew with any certainty was their consistent unknowability. And so, Starfleet, as was ever its nature, began to thirst for knowledge. Many in high command began to consider the tantalizing possibility of somehow capturing a Borg cube. If successful, they could study it in detail and develop countermeasures. Other, more cynical officers, particularly in Starfleet intelligence, were intrigued by the prospect of harnessing Borg technology, augmenting it with their own, and in so doing, achieving a technological leap against the Federation's increasing number of rivals. Such are the Faustian temptations one faces when one thirsts for knowledge. Yet the Federation are not the only ones who thirst for knowledge, seeking to evolve and improve themselves. Far beyond the stars, in the depths of dark space, over 7,000 light-years away, the Borg, too, seek knowledge. Yet, the collective's appetite for knowledge is far greater, a voracious hunger for something new, something dangerous. Hunger for knowledge, unchecked by caution, empathy, or that greatest wisdom enjoyed by all living things. Fear. Without fear, the collective's hunger knows no bounds, and in trying to satiate their appetite, they have unleashed something new, something terrible. In encounters with 8,471 species, the collective never experienced fear. Now, a tremor of deep primal fear would shake the entire collective. In 2373, the Borg happened upon a rift leading to another dimension, known only as fluidic space, a realm formed of organic fluid, devoid of celestial bodies, its sole inhabitants, the creatures known as species 8472. It is unknown whether this is a naturally occurring realm or a creation of the 8472. Upon encountering these creatures, the Borg attempted to add this distinctive creature to their collective, only to find it to be immune, its aggressive physiology proving too strong. And soon the Borg found themselves just as powerless and ineffective as the 8472 defended themselves, easily dispatching the invaders before travelling through the rift in order to assess the threat posed by the invaders. The 8472 concluded that the Borg and all potential Borg hosts should be exterminated. To prevent them from ever invading again, the entire galaxy must be sterilized. As the 8472 began their campaign of extermination, the collective still had yet to comprehend what they were truly facing. A perfect organism. The Borg calculated that the entire collective would be destroyed in less than a year. If the Borg were to have any hope of survival, they would have to adapt. Their collective required a new factor in its equation, a human factor. Species 5618 was hitherto the only other species that had successfully resisted the Borg's attempt at assimilation. The collective therefore concluded that if they were to defeat the 8472, they must add the biological and technological distinctiveness of humanity to their own. Given that the humans were unable to hold the first cube through conventional means, and they would require as many cubes as possible to keep the 8472 at bay, a single cube was concluded to be the most efficient course of action, and so was dispatched towards Earth on its vital mission. On the 7th of December, 2373, Deep Space 5 reported that the Federation colony on Ivor Prime had gone silent. Long-range probes would later confirm everyone's worst fears. The Borg had returned. That night, the dreams of many were disturbed by strange, inhuman whispers, growing closer. Words could be heard. Louder and clearer the voices chanted, "Resistance is futile." And they would awaken, only to be told that the Borg had returned, no longer confined to the domain of nightmares. Task Force Bravo, under Admiral Hayes, was on patrol, and so mobilized to rendezvous in the Typhon sector, along with elements of the 7th Fleet. However, the flagship, the USS Enterprise E, under Captain Jean-Luc Picard, would be a notable exception. For Admiral Hayes held concerns that Picard, having suffered a past trauma at the hands of the Borg, should not be placed in a position in which he may face them again. Yet many senior officers suspected that ulterior motives were at play. Nonetheless, within 8 hours the task force had fully assembled in the Typhon sector, mustering a total of 51 ships, with many crews in high spirits. While it was not lost on them how dangerous the Borg were, they had the utmost confidence in their ships and their training. Many headstrong, ambitious young officers were among their ranks, determined to prove themselves, while many of the senior, veteran officers were looking forward to some payback. In some ways, there was a palpable sense of relief among the fleet. Most of the crews had signed up to fight the Borg, only to find themselves on long, dull border patrols. Now, they were finally going to do the job they had trained for, and there was exhilaration as they charged towards battle. Confident of the ships and officers under his command, Admiral Hayes put into action one of the many battle plans that had been well rehearsed during the previous exercises. Rather than attempt to place a brick wall in front of the cube, he would instead confront it with a series of soft defences designed to wear the cube down. This would take the form of 3 picket groups. These would make hit-and-run attacks intended to slow the cube down and force it out of warp. Then the reserve ships would join, implementing the swarm tactics in which they had trained. Though Hayes made a single critical adjustment to this plan. Hoping to capture the cube, he ordered the fleet to wear it down and target power distribution nodes. Quantum torpedoes were not to be deployed without his express authorization. This vaulting ambition by Hayes would cost him. At 0822, the fleet detected the cube travelling at high warp on a direct course for Earth. Upon setting an intercept course, the Borg hailed the fleet, demanding they stand down. A futile request. The first attack wing of Mirandas and Defiance engaged, accelerating to maximum warp, then launching a full torpedo volley at the cube before breaking off so that the cube could not retaliate. The second attack wing, composed of Sabres and Mirandas, then made their attack, hitting the cube with another torpedo volley. This did far more damage than the Borg anticipated. After the first volley, they had adapted their subspace field, and yet only 2 of the second volley were blocked. However, this time the cube responded with a volley of its own. This came to little effect, only destroying one Miranda, the rest of the wing breaking off. Soon enough, the third attack wing made its attack run, and having remodulated their torpedoes again, did even more damage to the cube, forcing it to slow down. However, the Borg were learning quickly. When the Defiant attack wing made a second pass, instead of missiles, they responded with gravimetric charges, which instead of doing any direct damage, disrupted the warp field of the enemy ships, knocking them out of warp. This proved highly effective, knocking 2 Defiants and a Miranda out of the fight. While casualties on the ships were light, their warp assemblies were heavily damaged. By the time they could get back into warp, the battle would have moved too far away. The remainder of the attack line hit the cube with a bruising volley, and when the cube attempted to repeat the tactic on the second attack wing, they were ready. Flying in an irregular fashion, only 2 Mirandas were knocked out, and another withering volley slowed the cube even further. But before the Centaur wing could make their run, the cube fired an antimatter spread, blinding the enemy's sensors, allowing the cube an open shot with its missiles, destroying a Centaur and knocking 2 more ships out of warp. Still, the cube was powerless to defend itself from another bruising torpedo volley. It was clear to the collective that their enemy was far more coordinated than in their previous encounter. Protocol dictated that in such a situation, they should eliminate the command and control ships. Unfortunately, the cube was unable to identify any such vessels or decrypt the enemy communication protocols. This was due to the 3 Oberth-class ships attached to each wing, which were not only actively jamming Borg sensors, but also actively encrypting fleet-wide transmissions, preventing the Borg from countering their attacks. However, Hayes grew increasingly nervous. While the cube was being slowed down with each successive wave, his attack wings were beginning to thin, and so he was faced with a dilemma. He could either commit the cruiser wing from his reserve or authorize the Defiant wing to use quantum torpedoes. Still hoping to disable the cube, he ordered his cruiser wing into action. Reinforcing the attack wings, Even when faced with the firepower of the cruiser wing, the cube pressed on. Even as the Borg were relegated to limping at warp 5, the cube continued to lash out in retaliation. Once precise, methodically calculated strikes increasingly resembled the violent strikes of an injured animal. Even so, this injured animal was not to be taken lightly, destroying a New Orleans and 2 Sabres, and heavily damaging many other ships. This was enough to make the attack wings hesitate, buying the cube more time, allowing it to reach the perimeter of the Sol system. Only then did Hayes authorize the Defiant to fire its quantum torpedoes, finally bringing the behemoth out of warp. Now at impulse, the cube was free to unleash its arsenal, going on the offensive. Meanwhile, Hayes ordered the reserves to engage, attacking in a layered swarm formation. Upon being swarmed, the cube attempted to use its tractor beam. However, this was only partially effective. The remodulating Federation shields prevented the beam from establishing a positive lock, so while the beam could still deplete a ship's shields, it could not hold it in place while the shields were up. The highly erratic nature of the swarm also proved a challenge to the Borg, who were unable to isolate individual targets. The cube concluded that if they targeted the enemy ships forming the middle layer of the swarm, the outermost ships would be left without cover and the innermost would be unsupported. The cube then began to fire precisely calculated volleys of plasma charges designed to disrupt the enemy positioning, opening them up to the tractor beams. This proved highly effective, destroying a Sabre and an Excelsior. However, this effort proved costly, as all the while they were suffering the effects of a continuous torpedo barrage, and their weapons emplacements were being actively targeted by the innermost ships, severely impeding the cube's ability to fight. If they could not exploit enemy communications, the Borg elected to disrupt them. Having locked on to the Starfleet communications frequency, the cube transmitted a subspace pulse, overloading the comms array of the Oberths and causing heavy damage to the shipboard computers, also disabling the jamming signal. Unable to communicate, the fleet was forced to withdraw and regroup. However, with communications knocked out, it was a disordered withdrawal, causing several ships to become isolated, which the Borg exploited. At the same time, the Borg used this reprieve to regenerate some of the damage sustained. Hayes knew that if the Borg were allowed to regenerate, all their efforts would be undone, and so he ordered his cruiser wing to re-engage, unsupported, while the rest of the fleet regrouped. Yet, this sacrifice was not in vain, as just as the final remnants of the cruiser wing broke, the fleet re-engaged. No longer enjoying the benefits of jamming, the fleet was forced to adopt a more cautious approach, with the Borg now able to actively identify the critical command and control vessels. It successfully destroyed an Akira and a Sabre. Nevertheless, the cube was still unable to effectively defend itself, and was now taking damage at a far greater rate than it could repair. Suddenly, the cube came to an abrupt halt, its weapons shut off. Hayes, who had been commanding the battle from afar aboard the Sultan, ordered the fleet to cease fire, believing the cube to be disabled. He then ordered the fleet to move into transporter range to board the supposedly disabled cube. Yet, just as Sultan lowered its shield for transport, the cube pulsed back into life, seizing the Sultan and 6 other ships in its tractor beam. With their shields down, they were powerless, as the cube used its laser to sever their throats. Despite losing the commander, the fleet fought on, continuing to swarm and pummel the cube from every vector, to the point where several vessels such as Defiant and Bozeman had completely depleted their weapons. Undeterred, the Defiant's commander ordered ramming speed, yet just as he did, a new ship entered the fray, the USS Enterprise. At this point, the Borg power grid began to fluctuate. Many were unsure what this indicated. Was the cube on its last legs, or was it powering up? However, Picard knew exactly what it meant. The Borg were diverting all power to weapons, both from the subspace field and structural integrity field. Picard saw his opportunity and took it, ordering the entire fleet to concentrate fire just as they had drilled. The Akiras launched a torpedo barrage, breaking the hull armor. The Norways then opened fire with their lance phasers, boring deep into the cube. The Enterprise finally launched 3 quantum torpedoes into the breach. The detonation of these powerful weapons within the cube's mass resulted in cataclysmic damage, with the powerful zero-point energy surge ripping the cube apart from within. The cube was then finally atomized in a spectacular explosion, though not before the Borg, in one last desperate attempt, launched a sphere, hoping to escape. However, the Enterprise pursued it through time itself. And so Starfleet had defeated the Borg, avenging the slaughter of 6 years prior and proving to the collective that resistance was not futile. Today, Starfleet stood its ground, declaring, "This far, no further," and finally making the Borg pay for what they had done. This victory, albeit a costly one, confirmed Starfleet's belief in itself, filling its officers with the necessary courage and resolve to face the war to come. For the Borg, this was an unexpected and perhaps fatal setback. Without the biological and technological distinctiveness of humanity, they were unlikely to defeat species 8472. And so while Starfleet had saved Earth, little did they realize their heroic triumph may have doomed the entire galaxy.